Okay, yeah, welcome back to the crypt. I don't want to be judgy, but okay, so here's the thing. You remember that whole thing where I was talking about writing magazines? Okay, so there's an article in here. Who is this author? Audrey Niffenegger. Niffenegger. Definitely I'm pronouncing that wrong. This article was written by Liz Radford, and it's an interview with this author on the subject of point of view. And what book did they do? Time Traveler's Wife is how they're most well known. I've actually not read any of the books from this author. I have read some of the excerpts on Amazon Books, and I have read a lot of reviews because this interview with this author was the first time I had heard of this author, though I have heard in passing The Time Traveler's Wife, but I've never read it. But when I read this interview, there were a couple red flags that showed up about certain topics, and apparently this author has only really authored a few books. I think only 2 actual full books, and everything else has been more of a multimedia project. And when this was published, when was this published? This is a very old magazine. What year is this magazine? This magazine was 2013. It's been a while. So back then they were writing their 3rd book, which as far as I know still isn't out, which is fine. Books can take a long time. But I did find something really interesting. Like I said, there were a lot of red flags. Mostly this writer would talk about things like how you have to consider all of these things with point of view for characters, and then when they gave examples, the examples were all telling, not showing. Every single time an example was shown, there's even an excerpt of this person's work from, I think it's from her field for Symmetry. It's so hard for me to say. And the entire section has almost no showing. It's almost all telling. It's telling me that this character is this way. This sister is like this. She does this. Instead of allowing the characters to interact with each other and me to pick up on the fact that this sister makes more of the decisions and this sister is more of the whimsical one. You need to trust me to figure that out on my own through their interactions with each other. You don't need to tell me one sister is one way, but that's definitely what was going on in the text. Now, to be fair, there are ways you can utilize that, especially with manipulating your audience into false senses of security, but I don't think that's what's actually happening in this. But again, I could be wrong. This was just one part of her work. I haven't read an entirety of her book, but at some point during the interview, they were talking about things like comic book writing, because that's one of the multimedia things she's been involved with more often. She's done some graphic novel work, supposedly. Again, I haven't read any of it, but they were talking about different comics, and she was discussing some of the differences between the comic writing and writing for novels, which that is a legit thing. There is a huge difference between novel writing and writing for a comic or graphic novel script. Very, very different. It's very different forms of media. Some things that work in a novel will not work in graphic novel form, and vice versa. It's a very different media format. That being said, she said this to say, writing is speedy and economical. It takes a while to make a picture, even a simple picture. Oh boy. So maybe I would take that a little differently if I hadn't read samples of this woman's writing that were all telling and almost no showing. But that sentence really threw me off. Writing is economical? Speedy? speedy? I mean, to be fair, if I want to crank out a 0 draft, I can crank it out pretty quickly. I'm a decently fast writer myself. And there are definitely writers out there that are even faster than me. But that's not a finished work. That's not complete. Does she know that editing's a thing? Does she know that it takes years to get a story to a place where it's able to be published? It takes a while to make a picture, even a simple picture. Yeah, and it takes a long time, years, to make a novel, even a simple novel, good enough to be published and consumed by the general populace. Here's the topic I kind of wanted. All of this to say, I don't want to like hit on this author too hard because again, I haven't read this author's work in total. Like I haven't read an entire novel from this person. So this could be just, it sounds really weird because it's taken out of context, even though it's a whole interview. And I read the whole interview to see if she says numerous things that are kind of weird like that. Like she considers writing this very quick, easy thing that's so easy and everyone can do it. But you know, drawing something takes so much skill, and it's like, well, yeah, all forms of art take skill, including writing. I don't know, I just find it kind of weird, and I've seen this before where someone who dabbles in one particular artistic field will then kind of pass judgment on that, even though they're not even in that field, which is always so weird to me because my friend Mick is a drawing artist. She creates amazing, phenomenal works of art. And if I didn't know better, if I haven't watched her process and how much work goes into it, if I just glanced at it, I could say, oh, well, you know, here's me sitting here creating a book that takes me a year just to create a single draft, let alone all the other drafts, and she's able to create, you know, 2-3 pages of artwork in a couple hours. So, you know, her work is so much easier. But I know that's not true because that's just the sketch. That's just an initial sketch. It's not all the planning. It's not all of the cleanup. It's not all of the editing. And it's not the fact that just because she created a couple pages of art, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a complete work of art. If she wants to do a graphic novel, for example, there's a lot more that goes into that. It's a ton of work, and it can take the same amount of time it takes me to do a novel to make a really, really good graphic novel. Looking at someone else's art and saying, oh, well, that's more speedy and more economical, I'm like, that just kind of hits me weird because I don't think that's a real thing. I think all forms of art, depending on the size of the project and a lot of the techniques that go into the project, like if someone's going to make a stone statue and chisel it themselves by hand, that's going to take them a really long time. It's going to take a lot of physical effort. And you could say that that's harder to do than me sitting at a computer typing. Except that not everyone can sit at a computer and type a world into existence. And I don't mean to seem egotistical when I say that, but truly not everyone can do that. I think everyone has the capacity that they could learn to do that. I do believe that art is for everybody and everybody can participate, but not everyone wants to, not everyone has the drive to, and it is definitely true that not everyone has the talent to. Whether or not talent and hard work are interchangeable is a whole nother discussion, but suffice to say, not everyone is going to write a story, just like not everyone's going to chisel a statue or paint a painting. So I don't know, I found that a little strange. I've definitely heard that kind of stuff before where people look at art I do and say, oh, well, that's so easy, all you have to do is sit down and write. But it's like, well, sometimes it's easy, sometimes it flows, and sometimes it doesn't. And also the editing, which is, I would argue, one of the worst parts because it's the longest section of the work, that takes a really, really long time to do. And that doesn't even count the whole process of trying to get published, which is a whole nother world of crazy all by itself. That process can also take years to complete. So the process from start to finish of getting a book actually on a shelf for the public is a very lengthy process. And some people are very blessed and the path is shorter. Some people have resources to make it shorter, but that's definitely not the case for most artists. most authors take quite a long time to create a book. And I would say most artists that do drawings, it can take a long time for their stuff to get put in the public eye too, depending on what kind of work they're doing. I don't think one is easier than the other. I think they're just different forms of art and need different amounts of work put in. I also have this really strange feeling when coming back to the idea of like people who dabble in certain artworks, kind of passing judgment on it. It kind of makes me feel like it's almost as if someone came into town, your hometown. You've lived your entire life there, right? And they stay in Airbnb and they stay there for one night. And then they pass judgment on your entire town based on the like couple hours they spent in town and then their night at Airbnb. And they judge your entire town by that. It's like, dude, you don't even live here. Like, you don't even know. And I don't know. That's the kind of feeling I felt when I first read that little section of what she said, was that feeling of like, you don't even live here. Like, you mostly do any other project. Like, writing is like a side thing you picked up because you thought it would be easier than drawing the particular story you had in your head at the time. You thought writing was the shortcut of telling something, and you're definitely giving off that vibe in how you speak about the art as a craft. And I guess that's my next thing of like, I do have kind of a hard time with certain people who look on writing as a craft in that way, in this kind of flippant attitude of like, oh, writing's just so easy, you just sit down and you write. It's like, yes and no. Like, technically you sit down and you write, and there's not a lot to it. But if it was really that easy, then everyone would do it. And the point of the matter is, not everyone can do it. Not everyone can get published. Not everyone can even finish a novel. Just finishing one draft of one novel, there are a lot of would-be writers that haven't even completed that yet, because it is very difficult. It's one thing to say it in theory, it's a whole other thing to actually complete it. And also, again, to get it completed to where it's publishable. So I don't know, I always feel really awkward. I kind of, my personal feeling, which is probably kind of rude, but my personal feeling on people who tend to have that attitude is, I see them as people who, they're writers because they write, but I don't really consider them authors in my field. And I know that probably sounds really rude because this person is published and I'm not. And I don't know, I just feel kind of like, if you're going to look at the craft of writing in such a flippant manner that you could literally put the minimum amount of effort into your work and that's it, I don't know, like, that kind of rubs me the wrong way. But at the same time, like, this, when you do talk about art, you do have to realize that art is very much a point of perspective. So even though I have the opinion that you should actually put effort into your art, you shouldn't treat it that flippantly, and that there's a certain level of professionalism that should go into your art, especially if you're going to publish something and charge money for it. I do think there's professionalism that should be involved. But at the same time, I mean, you could say it's art, and if you're making it, well, art for art's sake doesn't really work when you're charging money though, right? So I guess, like, for me, I personally kind of consider those people to be writers, not authors, because I do believe being an author means, yes, you have fun with your craft, but you also do take it seriously. It's your career, it's something you're trying to actively better yourself at, no matter what. Like, every time criticism is shown up, even if the criticism seems really left field and out of nowhere, you do listen and you truly try to better yourself each and every time. I think that that is a huge element of being an author. I think, you know, taking the time to truly refine something to the best it can possibly be at that time is part of being an author, whereas being a writer is just, you know, kind of writing for the sake of it, and which is fine. There's nothing wrong with it. It's still writing, it's still valid, but I don't necessarily believe that those works should be monetized. But that's my personal opinion though. That's my personal opinion. What do you guys think? What are your feelings when you hear people in other art spheres that have dabbled in writing but aren't really, that's not really their industry, when they talk about writing, especially when they're flippant about it? How do you guys feel about that? Like, I don't want to be a bulldog about it. I don't want to be like this possessive person that's like, you can't touch my craft, because that's ridiculous. I do believe writing in and of itself is for everyone, and everyone has a right to that art. But I do think it's like rude and dismissive to say things like, writing's just this easy thing that you can just flippantly do. But, you know, my art form that I really am, my career is so much harder to manage. It's like, different art forms are just different. I don't think anyone is harder than another one. I think they're just different. And that's my personal opinion on it. But let me know what you guys think, and thank you guys so much for watching. Bye.